Good morning and welcome. Selamat pagi, selamat datang. It is a huge pleasure to be here. I've just been sitting with these three extraordinary guests briefly for 15 minutes in preparation, and just so excited listening to you, even just beginning to unpack the topics of this morning. So the title, as you've heard, is Unsettling Colonial Structures. And in the session description this morning, we read that decolonisation aims to challenge existing norms by emphasising place, indigenous knowledge and humane principles. I'm guessing that we might even find some challenges to that statement itself in our conversation this morning. How can we foster open-mindedness among conservatives and encourage them to explore how indigenous traditions and laws can drive innovation? How can we initiate a dialogue about reshaping settler colonial systems using indigenous law for a more sustainable future? This panel is an hour, and there will be discussion for around 45 minutes, followed by around 10 minutes for a few questions from the audience. And the panel members have asked me to make clear today that they won't be discussing the recent Voice to Parliament referendum in Australia, neither in discussion nor in questions at the end, so I ask you to respect that request. So, first of all, I'd like to introduce our guests. Thank you so much for joining. Next to me here is Todung Mulya Lubis, who's an Indonesian lawyer and human rights activist. He holds significant positions such as founder of the Lubis, Santosa and Maramis law firm, honorary professor at the Melbourne Law School, and has been ambassador of Indonesia in Norway and Iceland for 5 years. I think I'm going to let you speak a little bit more about your particular relevant experience when we come around. So, and I'm also delighted to welcome Professor Marcia Langton. Thank you for being here. Marcia is a distinguished anthropologist, geographer, and academic from the Yiman and Bidjara nations in Queensland, Australia. She has held since the year 2000 the esteemed position of Foundation Chair of Australian Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne, and serving as Associate Provost. And again, I'm going to invite you to speak a little bit more about relevant experience if you want to when the conversation unfolds. And finally, Professor Erin Corn, thank you for coming. Erin is an ethnomusicologist, is that correct? And working to foster meaningful partnerships with Indigenous colleagues, promoting recognition of Indigenous knowledge through research and education.
Sorry.
That's okay. It's keeping me awake, thank you.
Turn this off. Sorry.
It's not the worst thing that's happened today.
No, it's not. Marcia and Erin have this year co-written a book called First Knowledges, which we'll hear a little bit about today.
And this is the last copy of
this
it
is the
on
very
this
last
island,
copy.
so you can't buy it. Actually, you can probably download it on Apple Books. Yeah, you can buy it there. Yeah. Or ChatGPT. No, it's too young for that. It's not 2 years old.
So there's there isn't a lot of moderation that I'm going to be doing. I'm going to sit back and hear the three of you exploring these topics. I'd like to go to you first, Pat.
Go to me first.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, this is a big topic, and we've been discussing this for a long time, over and over. Because we have not been able to totally get rid of colonial structures. Indonesian legal systems was originated from Dutch time, when we were colonized by the Dutch. And the basic philosophies, in my opinion, being a lawyer for 40 years, more than 40 years actually, remain the same. Centralization, politics of centralization, politics of division, and politics of security and order. Now, I'm going to trying to describe, what are those three, politics. Indonesia consists of 17,000 islands, over 300 ethnic groupings, and 1,340 tribes. Yeah? And they have their own tradition, customary law, adat, and the problem is most of them not really taken into the system. They are being ignored, when we drafted the law. I'm in favor of decentralization of authority, of policy, not to mention regional regulations. But of course, I'm not advocating federalism or federal state, because Indonesia is a unitary state. Yeah? It is quite difficult for Indonesian to talk about federalism, even though I'm for it. Yeah? The regencies and provinces in Indonesia ought to be more autonomous, more independent. I think it is not wrong to structure the relations between the states and the province and the districts in a more loose arrangement. Because that seems to be the problems we are facing in Indonesia. Now, back to three issues that I mentioned earlier. One is politics of centralization. I'm going to give you one example about energy transition, because this is what subject that obsessed me the most lately. If we were to succeed in energy transition, monopoly of the state-owned companies in running energy business in Indonesia has to be dismantled. Indonesia, as I said earlier, has 34 provinces, and there's no way you can succeed, if you don't give the regions authority to run their energy business. I've been an ambassador in Norway for 5 years, and a lot of investors wanted to invest in Indonesia in order to help Indonesia in their energy transition. But the bottleneck is with the state-owned companies, and that monopolize this. So I guess, if we don't decentralize the energy business into the provinces, there's no way we can succeed in energy transition. This is one of remnants of the colonial policy, colonial structures that still intact in Indonesia. Now, how to restructure that? That is the challenge. Now, the second issues that I would like to mention here is what I call politics of division. Under the colonial times, populations were divided into three groups. One European, the other one is Far East, and the third one is the native, the pribumi, we call. Now, the European and the Far East, which is the Chinese actually, they have their own special tribunal or court, adjudications. But for the native, we have different one. Yeah? Now, we still have that kind of structures in Indonesia. We have general adjudications, general court, that resolve all the disputes, civil and criminals. But on the other hand, we have Islamic courts. Yeah. Now, I'm not in favor of that. I think being a unitary state, there should be a unitary legal institution as well. Yeah. How could we have two different judicial institutions for the citizens? But that's what happens. Yeah. But if we go beyond judicial institutions, then we have similar policies. Yeah. In getting credits, in getting licenses. Yeah. So I think the policy seems to me was originated from the Dutch colonial time when they preferred the European and the Chinese in getting all this privilege, all these concessions. Now the third one, what I would like to stress here, to emphasize is what I call politics of security and order. Of course, it is not easy to manage, to run the country with 17,000 islands, 300 ethnic groupings, with all the complexities we have in Indonesia. So security is important, order is important, but the way security and order is being implemented is a problem, because it reinforces actually the authoritarian characters of the policy. Now, I'm not saying that we can let all this business of security and order only to the regional governments, but at least, we should be able to give the regional authority more say in maintaining their order, their security in their regions. I'm not talking about Java because Java is more or less stable, in my opinion. But if you talk about Papua, for instance, if you talk about Aceh, for instance, it is not that easy to, to deal with all these issues in those two provinces. Now, imposing security and orders in Papua without, giving them also rights to manage their own business, governments, that would create a lot of problems, in the future. So these are the things that I would like to, to emphasize. But the question is how to change the colonial, the remnants of these colonial structures. Aside from having a top-down approach, it is more important to adopt local wisdoms and use them in bringing innovations and change in empowering people to determine their own futures. Not being dictated by the central governments alone. In other words, I'm talking about making democracy work at the local and regional level. Now, as a result of centralization inherited from the colonial times, the state has become too big and too powerful, and the people become so weak and disorganized. The state must be willing to delegate its power to the regions, to share some of its authority, and let the region grow with their own unique traditions and wisdom. I don't think we should let uniformity impose upon the society or the country. Probably I'll stop here, Katie.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was really beautiful. I heard the three key issues that you're interested in, the politics of centralisation, division and security and order, which are the legacies of colonialism. But I also heard some themes which I know are going to provide some interesting cross-cutting. The environment, for example, is maybe the topic which is unifying these conversations at the moment. Inclusion, democracy, justice, all of those topics coming through what you were saying. So, yeah, I wondered if there's anything that you heard that you want to chime in with.
Well, Australia has a very different political system from Indonesia. So Australia is a federation, and it is a federation that was created by the white colonial male settlers during the constitutional conventions of the late 19th century. And so, yes, Australia inherits a colonial system. So, to that extent, Australia shares that similarity with the inheritance of the Dutch colonial system, such as it is here. But what it means for Australia is, in terms of it being a federation, is that the colonies became states. We have some territories, but the states, in fact, have a great deal of power. And so we have a kind of reverse problem, particularly in relation to protection of the environment, climate change adaptation policies, net zero, and managing the influence of the fossil fuel industry on Australian politics and industry and the economy. The fossil fuel industry, needless to say, is extremely powerful in Australia. Australia is basically, economically a mine pit. And the effect of federation is that the royalties go to the states, not to the Commonwealth. So we don't have that problem of centralisation, and this is what makes it so very difficult in Australia, because the Commonwealth can't override the states with respect to some of their powers, because they're set out in the Constitution, and the state as the Crown receiving the royalties, is kind of sacrosanct in Australia. And so even if the Commonwealth government, any Commonwealth government, has a net zero policy or an environmental policy, it's impossible for the Commonwealth to implement it nationally, because the states have all of the power in relation to land titling and land regulation. The Commonwealth has very little power in relation to land titling, land regulation, land use. And so, the Queensland government could, for instance, completely clear the state of trees, and there is nothing that the Commonwealth could do about it. And the Queensland government is well on the way to approving vegetation clearance in most areas except for on Aboriginal land. So therefore, it's quite the opposite in Australia. And the impact that that has on Indigenous peoples is that Aboriginal laws, as of the kind that we describe in our book, Law, the Way of the Ancestors, are largely not recognised in legal systems, because you have state laws and Commonwealth law. Now, some are, but it's very rare. And, for instance, the Torres Strait Islander traditional adoption practices are now recognised. But it's taken 40 years to have recognition of that system. You have some rules in relation to evidence, but they're not laws, they're rules, court rules in relation to evidence, and sentencing that take into account customary law. But beyond that, there's very little. Of course, we have native title, we have land rights in the Northern Territory land rights legislation, and both of those statutes recognise customary law to a small extent. That is, especially in relation to native title, the traditions and customs that determine Aboriginal land tenure or Torres Strait Islander land tenure. But the title is so fragile that it doesn't function as an equivalent title in the Torrens system. And so, by and large, it is not possible for Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people to use their land or waters in any commercial way. And so Aboriginal titles, Torres Strait Islander titles, are not fungible.
Not fundable.
Not fungible.
Wow.
So in contrast to Indonesia, where there is a much greater degree of recognition of adat, we have very little in Australia. As I say, it's minimal. And that is why our book is so important. And we didn't really comprehend this when we began writing it. We just wanted to, do our job and be faithful to everything that we've learnt about Aboriginal laws and explain them according to the people that we've learnt from. But when we saw the book published and people said to us, there is no other book in the market like this, we thought, oh, is that right? We had a look around and it's right. There is no other book like ours in the market, because it's not since the early 1980s, when the Australian Law Reform Commission investigated Aboriginal customary laws, that anything substantial about what the English call Aboriginal customary laws has been published. Yeah. So ours is the first. And I think a lot of people are quite delighted with the way that we've done it, in, you know, bringing to the fore this kind of inner principles, the, you know, the sacred narrative quality of Aboriginal laws.
Yeah, it was actually Eddie Cabillo, who teaches law in the Melbourne Law School. He launched our book at the Melbourne Writers' Festival and in the Melbourne Law School afterwards. And I think it was when we were backstage at the Melbourne Writers' Festival, he said, you know, like, I'm going to buy class sets of this book for my first years. And we're going, oh, okay, that's nice. And we're sort of wondering why he would want to do that when, you know, I'm imagining there's just shiploads of material on this.
Don't swear.
Shiploads.
Shiploads.
Ship.
Oh.
Boatloads.
As in fish and chips. Okay.
Boatloads.
Okay.
Yeah, fish and chips. Oh dear. See, this is why we write well together. And you know, I was imagining boatloads as material. He said, no. I mean, the whole legal profession is basically taught through case law. You know, it's taught through rulings in courts. It's not taught from a position of the philosophy of law, which is effectively what this book is. It's more about, well, why do we have laws, and what makes a good person good, and what makes a society functional, and why are laws necessary to begin with. He said, you know, even in the Western legal tradition, you know, they get about 3 weeks of that in first year, and that's it. So that sort of floored me at the time, because I had no idea we were writing a book that would actually fill a void like that. I didn't realise the void existed. Like, we're not lawyers. We were just asked to write a book about what is generally called in Australia customary law, or the dreaming, or whatever other euphemism you want to use for it. And so this is the way that we came up with to do it, without going over the well-worn tropes and understandings of Aboriginal spirituality that we think we understand, but we really don't.
But I will say that we have, I think, comprehensively made the point that Aboriginal laws are laws.
Absolutely.
They're not LORE, they're not spirituality, they're not, you know, woo-woo. They're actual laws.
Okay.
They just work differently from other bodies of law. Yeah.
But in adat law, you know, here in Indonesia, Marcia, there's always been a conflict between adat law and national law. Yeah. So I don't know, whether you have the same conflict as well in Australia, and if you do, you know, how could you reconcile, you know, the tension between Aboriginal law, you know, and the national law of Australia? In our case, it is not that easy. The adat law doesn't function properly. Yeah, it does to a certain extent. When you have a land disputes, then you may use, you know, adat law as your defense, because under the adat law, the land belongs to the community. Yeah, it's not individual. Yeah, but under national law, yeah, it is individual ownership that prevails. So how do you reconcile that in Australia, if that is the case?
Yeah, well, we have exactly the same tension in Australia. But even more so because native title is legislated. And so therefore, even while native title is recognised as a joint or commonly held title, you have these disputes. They're not easily resolved because, you know, you have to go to the court, becomes an adversarial matter, you know, with lawyers on each side arguing the case. They're never going to be able to resolve the issue because that's not how you resolve land disputes. You have to use customary law to achieve consensus and a compromise. That's the only way to it that it can work. But our laws don't allow for that. And so, you know, I often advise people who are in dispute, don't go to court. You'll never get a satisfactory outcome.
Yeah.
Try to sort it out amongst yourselves using customary law. Use your own laws.
Well, if you don't go to court, how is it going to be enforced?
You could make a submission to the court based on a settlement.
Okay.
Yeah. But, you know, this is a very rare outcome, isn't it? But we do have indigenous land use agreements provided for under the Native Title Act, and that's been pretty good at settling not just Aboriginal disputes with external stakeholders who want to access land, but also indigenous land use agreements have been used as the settlement of intra-Aboriginal disputes. So we have that one small area of native title law that could be used, but lawyers prefer adversarial proceedings,
yes.
right?
Yes.
So you have to have the Aboriginal people push hard for a settlement under an Indigenous land use agreement. They have to want to have a compromise and a settlement that, you know, resolves the issues. Because a court outcome will take one side or the other, and that is never going to be a satisfactory outcome, and it doesn't end the dispute. So, look, colonial regulation of land matters and environmental use is a huge problem of this system.
Yeah.
So if Aboriginal people want to protect their environment, they really have to step outside of the legal system and use, say, administrative mechanisms like Indigenous protected areas and offer up their own land under an agreement with the Commonwealth for their land, a proportion of their land to be used solely for biodiversity conservation. And they simply stay out of the courts and they do an agreement with the Commonwealth. So we've got several hundred of those, and all up, the Aboriginal contribution to the National Reserve System is now 50% larger than any other landholder in the country, any other stakeholder, including governments. And that's because Aboriginal people are driven by the overriding motive to protect the environment. There are so many assaults on our environment. Australia has the highest rate of mammal extinction in the world.
That's non-human mammals, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so far.
Just checking.
So far.
I haven't checked the news this morning. What act is the Indigenous protected areas under? Because that
It's
is
not under an act, that's
It's
what
not
I'm
under-
saying. It's an
okay.
administrative mechanism. It's an
Right.
agreement with the Commonwealth.
But they're the areas where
Where the
Yeah.
greatest expression of Aboriginal law
Yeah.
is enabled by Aboriginal ranger teams,
Yeah.
and elders, cultural elders protecting the environment. That is where you see Aboriginal law in action. So going to your point about, energy transition, I think if we can step into that area and have these administrative mechanisms working in our favour more than disputes in native title, we might. And there are a lot of Aboriginal groups now turning to green energy as the economic way of the future, and trying to, do deals to get out of the fossil fuel industry. So, I think there's some hope there.
there's quite a lot of success in carbon farming, isn't there?
Carbon farming is big in the Aboriginal world. We have a lot of carbon farming.
And blue carbon, which isn't operationalised. But
No.
people are thinking about it very
Yeah.
strongly.
Yeah.
So I'm tracking as I'm listening to you speak, and I was really moved by, there was a point when you said, in the context of environmental protection, there was a point when you said Aboriginal people are, and there was a pause while you were looking for a word, and I'm telling myself a story that to try and find a word that would convey the feeling. It took some time. And why am I mentioning that now? It's because when I have dipped into your book, one of the things that's moved me most and has been most illuminating has been the way that you've described really beautifully the ways in which these laws are absolutely internalised. It's not a system out there which is being imposed. It's a way of being and living and breathing together. And I think that's something which is maybe alien to most people who are here in the room. And I'd be really curious if there is an example that you could share about the ways in which those laws are a lived thing, the ceremony, how it becomes part of how communities be together.
Well, I guess, one of the things that Aboriginal law does, and this is only a partial answer to your question, is imbue a sense of personal responsibility.
Yep.
So each individual is born with obligations and responsibilities under Aboriginal law. And, you know, looking after the environment is one of them. So I hesitated because I was trying to think, well, is responsibility going to cut it with this audience? Does it convey the meaning, you know?
I hear the word obligation a lot in
Yeah.
conversations at home. People say you have to live your obligations. And
Yeah.
that means different thing to different people, of course, but for Aboriginal people I'm talking to, it means the kinds of things Marcia's talking about.
Yeah. So these are obligations, and not only, see, they're inherited obligations, they're inherited from a sacred past, so you can't mess with them,
Yeah.
right? And you have an obligation to pass them on to the next generation.
Yeah.
And that can be caring for places, it's caring for family, it's being a good person. It's simple things like if you are driving in a car and you see a family struggling with their shopping, you have to pull over and pick them up.
Yeah. And I think what I'm hearing is not just have to, it's want to. There's an impulse there. It
It is the way of being,
Yeah.
right? There is no other way of being.
Yeah. And I'm kind of making a connection back to one of the first things you were talking about this legacy of the politics of security and order here in Indonesia, which is power over. And you're not talking about a system of power over at all.
No, and this is actually one, you know, one of the problems in Australia. It's the local and the regional that you talk about. So the Australian system, you know, doesn't want local and regional Aboriginal input to decision making. And it's a great tragedy, but, you know, it's the only thing that works for us. So you have, you know, nearly 1,500 ethnic groups. In Australia, we probably have about 600. So to that extent, we have a very similar problem. How do we allow for, you know, these local peoples to participate in democracy?
Well, I guess you have a very functional democracy in Australia, so to speak. Why are you laughing? At least if you compare that with Indonesia. No. Well, I may be wrong.
Compared to some parts of the world, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
But here, although we embarked on democracy since 1998, when we started our reformasi, yeah, but democracy is in decline, actually. Yeah. I'm not hesitating to say that, although in the first 10 years after reformasi, we have a very vibrant democracy. But lately, we have so many regressions in our democratic practices in Indonesia. So, under this kind of circumstances, it is not easy to get what you call input, you know, or feedback from the society. You know, everything is under the control of political parties. The mistake we made when we started reformasi is to give power to the political parties, so they control everything.
To the
Political parties.
Oh, yeah, to the political parties,
there's
yes.
no way you can change, you know, reform the country without going to political parties. Yeah.
Yeah.
If it is what you call democracy, it has a weakness in itself because not everyone belongs to political parties. So that's why we need, you know, vibrant, active civil society. But what happened to the civil society? Because when I talk about civil society, I'm also talking about civil society representing the other communities. They are very big, very strong, but they don't have, you know, access to the decision-making process. That is the problem, you know, here. But I'm not saying that we don't, you know, make improvement, but the improvement is a bit too little, too late. Yeah? We are facing very, you know, serious challenge in reviving, you know, our democracy back, yeah, after 1998.
And I think both Indonesia and Australia, we used to think that it was not true, but I think now countries like Indonesia and countries like Australia are both in the, facing the same threat of rogue capitalism, capturing our democratic systems and, changing the course of democracy so that, the power to make decisions about climate change adaptation, about net zero, about the fossil fuel industry will be controlled by, cabals who are able to influence political parties. And they also have an enormously influential impact on ordinary people, so that people will believe a conspiracy theory rather than, vote in favour of something that's in their own interests.
Yeah, and that's the disintegration of civil society at two different levels. It's the state capture by capital.
By rogue capital, yeah.
Yeah.
That's why we need not only transparency in who's donating to whom when it comes to politics, but we also need truth in political advertising for these very reasons.
Hear, hear. I'm going to be moving over to the audience in probably about 4 or 5 minutes. The invitation is we'll have time for a few questions, and the invitation is to ask one question directly to one of the panel members. And I think for these last few minutes, first of all, I'm noticing there's an impulse in me as we go down into some very, very difficult truths. There's an impulse for me to kind of go, oh, tell me about the great things that are working in your countries. So that might be a possibility. That might also be my conditioning, not wanting to end on a sad or hopeless note. So that might be a possibility if there's something that you would like to share that really lights you up with some optimism. Or if there's something which hasn't been spoken yet about you.
I think both of our countries make really good beer. Does that help?
I'm feeling better, Aaron, thank you.
Are you?
Or if there's anything that's still alive from the topics that we've already covered.
I think I'm good. Is there any?
Please.
Nope. She would like to ask.
Sure.
He needs a mic.
Thank you. My question is, good morning, it's directed to Pak Mulya. I used to work for you, and you are forever and remain my mentor, a model for me. I remember back in, say, 12 years ago, we talked about an updated version of your In Search of Human Rights that only covered up to 1990. For some reason, of course, we never materialized that. Well, wish and I trust still have fond memory of those times. So, if you are to do an updated version today, if In Search of Human Rights of Indonesia, what would be the pivotal or central themes of that book? If you were to do it today, an updated version of In Search of Human Rights in Indonesia. Thank you.
Thank you. Well,
Yes.
shall I answer that?
Yes, please.
No. Okay. Haryanto Ming talked about my dissertation that was published back in 1993. I finished my dissertation in 1990 when I studied at Berkeley. My dissertation is on human rights because that was the first time ever in Indonesia under the new order human rights book or dissertation has ever written. At that time, human rights was a taboo. Yeah, people don't talk about human rights because, in the eyes of the governments, especially, not the people, what people have was duty duty to the governments, duty to states. Yeah, they don't have rights. And Indonesia is perceived as a state based on family, in which the head of the families take care of all of the citizens, all of the members of society. But I don't believe that, especially in a country as big as Indonesia, where you have close to 280 million people. We need a governance, we need governance, we need rules, we need a human rights protection. So that dissertation, my dissertation was written in 1990. That was under that kind of circumstances when I wrote that. So that's why the title is In Search of Human Rights. Now, of course, there are a lot to be written, to be updated. But again, you know, there are so many people writing books on human rights at this time. You know, I don't remember how many books on human rights have been published, but there are a lot. You know, so I think it is their job, their task, you know, to update, you know, what I've written already in 1990. Yeah, while I'm now more focused on anti-corruption, yeah, because this is the issues that I've been also very much concerned with. Yeah, because corruption is so systemic, so endemic, and so widespread. Yeah. 2 weeks ago, one minister of Agriculture was detained by anti-corruption agencies. Under this presidency, we have 6 ministers detained for corruption, and 5 of them have been sent to jail. So can you imagine, you know, in a country which talk, you know, a lot of transparency, accountability, you know, human rights respect, yeah, you have such kind of situations. So I'm focusing more of my time there. I think Haryanto Ming is the one that you should continue my, you know, my work.
Under your tutelage. Under your tutelage, for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. Go to the lady at the front over here.
There's a microphone.
Oh,
I've got
Oh,
it here if I
there's
he
a
may.
holds the
Man's
microphone
got the
already.
microphone.
The power of the talking stick.
Preloaded.
And my question's for Marcia. I've found it a bit confusing to see the transition in description from First Peoples to First Nations, which to me seemed like something imported from a concept in North America. So I'm just sort of wondering how that concept of being First Nations fits with first laws, and has that change in definition resulted in empowerment or division in the Australian context?
If you read our book, you'll see that we don't use the expression First Nations. I don't use it, especially in my scholarly work. I talk about First Peoples. Yes, the concept of First Nations is clearly imported from Canada, where Native American groups that have treaties, be they the numbered treaties or modern treaties, have self-government arrangements, these self-government arrangements are funded by the Canadian government. They have the Assembly of First Nations, you know, and it's recognised politically, and so they've been using the term First Nations for many decades since they won a change to the Canadian Constitution in the 1980s. When Canada began its decolonial movement and sought to become free of the British monarchy, the Indian chiefs, the Native American chiefs, with the treaty groups, went to the Queen and said, "We're disturbed by this Republican movement because our treaties with the Crown must be retained, must be recognised under the new Canadian Constitution. And so that move forced the Republicans to write into the new Canadian Constitution Article 35, which retrospectively recognises all treaties. So even if a treaty were made today, a modern agreement, it would be constitutionally recognised. And also it enshrined the principle of the right to be consulted. And so, these are very high standards of rights, which we don't have in Australia. And so many Indigenous Australians use the term First Nations as a slogan for the aspiration for those rights. But we use the term First Peoples.
Yeah, we spend about, 240 pages explaining actual legal concepts in actual Australian languages to the greatest approximation we can achieve in English, which is not a great language to be translating those concepts into. And so a lot of our descriptions for legal terms will be, a paragraph long because there are no direct English translations. So when you read the book, you will find us doing that, and really all terms we use for these ideas and concepts in English are merely terms of convenience, or in my opinion, inconvenience, because we're just not literate enough in either the languages or legal concepts of Australia, the original Australia, to even begin these conversations in any meaningful way. And even though, this book was it was a major undertaking to get these words on the page, looking at it now, I still think we've just barely scratched the surface. There's so much more that's still unsaid.
And, the point is, every Indigenous group has their own origin story, right? And so I think it's highly disrespectful to override the views of Indigenous people who have their own story about who they are, and slam, some kind of trendy black sovereignty slogan over the top of them that they themselves don't use. The people who use these terms really are not familiar with either Canadian law or Australian law. It's just a slogan. And anyway, the courts have defended the Aboriginal principle of spiritual affiliation in at least 2 cases, in Love and Tom's, and in a couple of other cases as well, but I won't be boring and go to those cases. So we use the term First Peoples, and it is, I think, preferred by the majority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who understand what the issues are. And we don't use it in a sloganistic way. It's simply recognition of the fact that our ancestors arrived in Australia at least 65,000 years ago. It has no political, connotation or baggage.
Great question, and really, beautiful answer. Thank you. I wonder if the lady at the front, if your question is still alive for you at the moment. Okay, great, thank you. Thank you. The lady who's standing up at the back.
Thanks, Marcia. I was very interested in you mentioning the environmental protection and biodiversity conservation provisions in Australia, and the fact that they're a Commonwealth law and the states are the ones that have the power of approval over fossil fuel developments. And I'm wondering, that Act, as you would well know, is coming up for review very shortly. And the main thing that the climate movement is lobbying for in that review is that considerations of climate change and emissions should be part of what the federal minister has to consider when there's appeals against states approving fossil fuel projects. What I'm wondering is whether you have any suggestions as to what you think should be changed in the Federal Act on Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation and whether you see climate change as a particular issue that Indigenous interests would like to see it open to being addressed in that Act.
Oh, that's a huge question, isn't it? I'm not capable of answering it properly here, but of course, a simple answer is yes and yes and yes. But it comes down to the detail. We've tried very hard to get Commonwealth agreement across 3 governments now, but particularly the last 2 governments on cultural heritage protection, and it's proved to be impossible. People of the Torres Strait Islanders are in the United Nations now over the failure of the Commonwealth government to act responsibly in relation to the threats that climate change poses to them. There are hundreds of coastal Aboriginal communities that are under similar threat. It would be... you'd think that the Australian government and all the state governments would understand the threat of the climate change and the tipping point that scientists say that we've reached now, and legislate responsibly for all Australians. I think we have a long way to go before we get to that point, but very good question. The devil's in the detail. Yeah. Sorry I can't answer it more adequately here.
Thank you. Yes, question from you, sir. There are 2 mics making their way to you.
I would be interested to hear from you what is the solution where the adult law or the traditional law of the Aborigines is clashing with from the colonial powers imposed laws. Not necessarily the adult law is more human, or the traditional law of the Aborigines is more human than the one is imposed by the colonial powers. For me, the real question is, where is more humanity practiced?
Yeah, I wonder, anyone might have a response for this.
All right. Of course, not all adult law, in line with humanity principles. I acknowledge that. But in most cases, adult law take into consideration the interests of the community, of the people at large. But they are not enforceable, mostly, because since we independence, we have national law, which some of them also inherited from the colonial times. When we talk about the civil code, it is still a code that was imported in early 1900 in Indonesia. We are now, still in the process of drafting a new civil code in Indonesia. So it is really up to the judges, to judiciary to decide, which one is applicable or not. But the problem you are pointing out is very true, that there's a tension, there's a conflict between national law, some of them originated from the colonial law, and the adult law. So how to reconcile that, Now, in most cases, in my opinion, the judiciary doesn't take adult law, as the basis of their consideration in making their judgment. Yeah, that is what my take. Whether humanity, human rights, human interests have been taken into considerations. We have so many new laws enacted by the governments and the parliament that adopted that human right principle. Yeah. So those are the things that we always emphasize, especially for me, yeah, being a lawyer, when I go to court to represent my clients. I always cited the human rights principles, whether it comes from the international human rights instruments, yeah, or national human rights law. Yeah. But again, the judges would have to decide, yeah, all of this.
Thanks.
Oh, and that's essentially the position in Australia too. We don't have strong human rights laws. We don't have a Bill of Human Rights. I think 2 states have human rights principles legislated. It's not comprehensive, but you know, we have the Australian Human Rights Commission. We have the Racial Discrimination Act. We have sexual discrimination and age discrimination legislation. But there's a lot missing from our human rights framework. There's almost no recognition of Aboriginal customary law in any case. On the very rare occasion that such a conflict comes before the courts, which is the only place where they can be resolved, apart from, you know, as I said before, local agreements. The decisions aren't always satisfactory because, you know, the judiciary don't understand Aboriginal customary law. And when a particular judge does, such as the great Justice Tui, for instance, he put some conditions around consideration of Aboriginal customary law, but, you know, that was 30 years ago. And young lawyers today don't, as Eddie Cabillo, you know, Dr. Eddie Cabillo in the Melbourne Law School pointed out to us, don't learn any of this. They don't know anything about it. So Justice Tui said that if lawyers for, say, perpetrators of assault are going to put forward a customary law defence, then the lawyers have to present evidence of customary law, not just assert that the assault followed customary, some you know, mystical customary law principle. And in the Northern Territory, those defences have been overruled. You've got mandatory sentencing, you know, the 3-strike law. Yeah. You've got massive incarceration rates. They're skyrocketing. So I think Indigenous people in Australia are incarcerated at 24 times the rate of other Australians. We're nearly 4% of the population, but 25% of the prison population are Indigenous. 100% of the children in detention centres, juvenile detention centres in the Northern Territory are Aboriginal. And so, you know, the crisis in the justice system is so extreme at the moment that many people are thinking we simply don't have the luxury of looking at, you know, human rights, customary law rights, because the overriding human right for most people at the moment in Australia is raising the age of criminality from 10 to 14. So, you know, we're down to just, you know, the hard yards.
There's not a single comprehensive legal glossary from any Australian language to English that a lawyer could even draw on.
Thank you. Yeah, we are... Okay. Beautiful, thank you. Yeah, we are out of time now. Thank you so much for questions. Pak Todung, Marcia, Aaron, thank you so much for joining. Can we have a round of applause?